One moment, life is ordinary, the daily routines, the laughter, the quiet comfort of family. And the next, everything changes in the blink of an eye. For one family, an unexpected incident shattered their sense of security and turned their world upside down. What was once a life of normalcy became a haunting journey of uncertainty, filled with unanswered questions and an overwhelming desire for answers. The Sodder family lived in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, in a home perched on a hill overlooking the surrounding countryside. The family consisted of George and Jenny Sodder, both of Italian descent, and their 10 children, who were born between 1923 and 1943. George, the father, had emigrated from Italy as a young man, while Jenny was born in the United States. George operated a successful trucking business, and the family was well respected in the local community. They lived a relatively quiet and stable life, though there were a few incidents and challenges in their past that may have contributed to the tragedy that would unfold. On the evening of December 24, 1945, a seemingly ordinary Christmas Eve turned into a nightmare for the Sodder family when their home caught fire in the early hours of the morning. The fire broke out around 1 o'clock as the family fell asleep. George and Jenny Sodder were in their bedroom on the ground floor of their 2-story house, while their 9 children were scattered in bedrooms on the 2nd floor. The fire started in the area of the house that was near the attic, where a small Christmas tree was said to have been placed earlier in the evening. In the dead of night, the family was abruptly awoken by the sound of a loud fire alarm, followed by the overwhelming smell of smoke filling the air. At first, George thought the smell might have come from a nearby neighbor, but soon it became apparent that the fire was inside their own home. The thick smoke poured into the lower floors, forcing George and Jenny to act quickly to protect their children. In their panic, George and Jenny rushed from their bedroom to wake the upstairs children. Realizing the severity of the fire and the speed at which it was spreading, they managed to wake 4 of their children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, who were able to flee the house with their parents. However, 5 of the younger children, including Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still trapped upstairs. In the chaos, George quickly attempted to climb up to the 2nd floor to reach his children. He grabbed a ladder that was usually kept outside for repairs, but found it was mysteriously too short to reach the windows on the 2nd floor. The ladder's inability to reach the children's rooms only escalated the sense of panic. George tried other methods to save the children. In his desperation, he also attempted to drive his truck close to the house and used it as a makeshift platform to try to rescue the children from the upstairs windows. He revved the engine, hoping the truck's height could help him reach them, but the truck stalled inexplicably, rendering his effort futile. Meanwhile, Jenny scrambled to get to the phone to call for help. But amid the chaos, the phone line was suddenly cut off, adding another layer of confusion and frustration to the dire situation. Despite all of George and Jenny's frantic efforts to rescue their children, the 5 missing kids, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, disappeared without a trace. The fire, though devastatingly intense, seemed to have no clear answers in its wake. It burned fiercely for hours, completely engulfing the house in flames. However, when the fire had finally been extinguished and the firefighters arrived, the Sodder home was reduced to a pile of charred debris, yet there was no sign of the missing children. The fire had consumed nearly everything in its path, but no bones or remains of the children were found in the wreckage. What added to the horror was the inexplicable absence of the children's bodies, even though the fire had been strong enough to cause severe damage to the house. In cases of intense fires, it is common for some remains to be found, even if they are badly burned. But in this case, there was nothing to suggest that the 5 children had been inside when the house burned. The authorities initially assumed that the children had perished in the fire, their bodies somehow completely consumed by the flames. However, the lack of any evidence, such as remains or even bones, left George and Jenny doubting the official conclusion. The fire had burned for hours, yet nothing seemed to have been left behind by the children who had supposedly been trapped upstairs. This glaring inconsistency led the Sodders to begin questioning the fire's true nature and its tragic consequences. Though the fire was an undeniably tragic event, it was the aftermath that would propel the case into the realm of the extraordinary and perpetually unsolved. George and Jenny, despite the overwhelming grief of losing 5 of their children in such a sudden and horrific manner, were far from accepting the official explanation that their children had perished in the fire. In the wake of the blaze, they began to scrutinize every detail and questioned the conclusions drawn by local authorities. While the fire had indeed been devastating, they believed there was something more to the story, something sinister that had not been fully understood or investigated. From the outset, Several factors immediately seemed to contradict the idea that the children had died in the fire. The most glaring inconsistency was the absence of any remains, particularly bones, among the rubble of the destroyed home. In typical cases of intense fires, even when a structure is gutted, remnants of bones and other traces of the deceased are often found amid the ashes, albeit severely burned. The fact that there were no remains of the children in the rubble was highly unusual and raised a great many questions. George, ever the skeptic, refused to believe that his children's bodies had been completely consumed by the fire, particularly since the flames were not as intense in some areas of the house as they had been in others. The fire might have been destructive, but the absence of remains suggested to George and Jenny that their children might not have been in the house at all when the fire started. The mystery deepened as the Sodders launched their investigation into the fire. Several locals came forward with reports that seemed to confirm George's suspicions. Witnesses claimed to have seen the 5 missing children alive after the fire had started. Some residents reported seeing the children being driven away from the house, either in a truck or a car, shortly after the blaze began. One witness even claimed to have spotted the children in a car near a nearby river, just hours after the fire had started. These sightings were incredibly troubling for the Sodders, as they strongly suggested that the children had been removed from the house alive, rather than having perished in the flames. However, despite the intriguing nature of these reports, many of these claims were impossible to fully verify. No one could provide hard evidence of the children's whereabouts or the car seen near the river. Still, these accounts remained lodged in George and Jenny's minds, adding to the growing sense of doubt that their children had simply died in the fire. Another key detail that raised suspicions involved the investigation itself. When the fire was first reported, the local fire department and law enforcement quickly deemed the incident a tragic accident. The initial response from authorities was lackluster, and there was a general eagerness to move past the event with the conclusion that the fire had caused the deaths. The Sodders, however, could not accept this simple explanation. They felt that something far more complicated and suspicious was at play. They were not just dealing with a random tragedy. They believed that someone had deliberately set the fire and that the children had been taken before it had fully consumed the house. In their minds, the lack of evidence and the strange sightings of their children alive after the fire only fueled this theory. Determined to get to the truth, the Sodders took matters into their own hands. They hired private detectives to investigate the fire further. The private investigators conducted interviews with residents, hoping to uncover any leads or details that might help explain what had truly happened to the children. The more they learned, the more questions arose. It became clear that the local authorities were not as diligent in their investigation as they should have been, and George and Jenny became increasingly convinced that something more nefarious was at play. The police seemed content to chalk up the tragedy as a straightforward case of a house fire, and they were not receptive to the Sodders' growing concerns. This lack of thorough investigation only deepened George and Jenny's belief that the authorities were either incompetent or deliberately neglectful in their handling of the case. Frustrated with the slow progress and the dead ends they encountered, the Sodders pressed on with their search for answers, determined to uncover the truth about what had happened to their children. Through their research and the private detectives' work, the Sodders uncovered details that hinted at a much darker picture. Some investigators speculated that the fire may have been set deliberately as part of a larger, more calculated scheme. But again, hard evidence was scarce. They also began to wonder if someone in the community with a grudge against the Sodder family had orchestrated the whole ordeal. A few people had made vague statements in the weeks before the fire, and the Sodders couldn't help but suspect that they had been targeted by someone with malicious intent. The family's sense of urgency grew with each passing day, as they faced the terrifying prospect that their children had been abducted and that their lives might still be in danger. The slow pace of the official investigation and the lack of concrete information only solidified their resolve to pursue every avenue, even when faced with countless dead ends. The case, they realized, was not just about a lost family. It was about uncovering a conspiracy that seemed to involve forces larger than their understanding. As they persevered in their search, the Sodders' distrust of local authorities continued to grow. They began to look at the fire with a sense of disbelief, wondering how they could have missed so many obvious red flags. They felt as if they had been abandoned by the very people who were supposed to help them, and their efforts to find answers were often met with indifference or obstruction. But despite the odds, George and Jenny refused to give up. Their faith in finding the truth never waned, and they kept their mission alive even in the face of overwhelming adversity. To them, this wasn't just a case of 5 missing children. It was a deeply personal fight for justice, one that would continue for decades. Through sheer determination and the support of the private detectives they hired, the Sodders never stopped searching, convinced that their children had not perished in the fire, but had been taken for reasons they could not yet understand. What began as a tragic house fire on a cold Christmas Eve quickly evolved into a nationwide mystery. As the Sodders began to investigate further into the mysterious fire, they uncovered more strange and perplexing details that fueled their suspicions and led them to entertain the possibility of foul play. One of the most compelling theories to emerge was that the fire had not been an accident, but rather had been deliberately set as part of an arson scheme. This theory was based primarily on the strange fact that no remains of the children were found despite the severity of the fire. They speculated that the fire could have been an act of revenge, or even an attempt to extort money from George Sodder, who had made his living in part through his trucking business. George was known to have business dealings with individuals who had questionable reputations, and some people in the community had suggested that he may have crossed the wrong person. In this theory, the fire would have been intended to destroy the Sodder family's home, but more importantly, it would have been designed to harm or kill them. The idea was that the arson could have been a means of intimidating George, or perhaps even an attempt to punish him for an unknown slight. However, despite the plausibility of this motive, there was no solid evidence to support the idea that George had made enemies who would go so far as to set his house on fire. The authorities had never uncovered any clues that pointed to a specific individual or group, and the motivations for such a drastic crime remained unclear. Nevertheless, this theory, though speculative, resonated with some of the family's supporters, who believed that it explained the intensity of the fire and the peculiar absence of remains. While the idea of an arson scheme was certainly disturbing, it was the theory of a kidnapping that seemed to gain the most traction as the Sodders delved deeper into their investigation. This theory suggested that the fire had been a cover-up for the deliberate abduction of the 5 missing children. The idea that the children had been taken alive rather than perishing in the fire was given weight by the lack of any remains in the aftermath of the blaze. This theory was further supported by the strange and compelling reports from witnesses who claimed to have seen the children in the days following the fire. Some people reported seeing the children being driven away from the scene of the fire in a car or truck, and one particularly unsettling account even mentioned spotting the children near a river shortly after the fire had been extinguished. These testimonies, while difficult to verify, provided a glimmer of hope to the Sodders that their children might still be alive. What added weight to the kidnapping theory were the mysterious and unnerving phone calls that the Sodders had received in the months leading up to the fire. Several times, George and Jenny had received calls at their home from unidentified individuals who would hang up without saying a word when George answered the phone. On at least one occasion, the caller seemed to speak in an unintelligible or threatening manner before abruptly disconnecting. If the children had been taken before the fire reached its peak, it would explain why no remains were found in the ruins of the house. It fit too well with the unusual circumstances they had witnessed and the unsettling behavior of those around them. In the end, though, the evidence that emerged did little to resolve the case definitively. Despite years of investigation, the Sodders could never conclusively prove that their children had been kidnapped or that the fire had been deliberately set. In 1952, they took the unusual step of erecting a large billboard along the highway, offering a substantial reward for any information that would lead to the discovery of their missing children. The billboard featured clear photographs of the 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, along with a heartfelt plea for anyone who might know their whereabouts to come forward. The Sodders hoped that this public display would attract the attention of someone who had seen the children or had knowledge of their fate. The billboard was strategically placed along a well-traveled route, ensuring maximum visibility, and it did garner some public attention. The billboard was one of the many desperate attempts made by the Sodders to keep the memory of their children alive and to renew interest in the case. But it provided no answers and only deepened their sense of frustration and helplessness. In 1967, nearly 2 decades after the fire, George and Jenny took the extraordinary step of consulting a medium in hopes of gaining some clarity about what had happened to their children. The medium reportedly told them that their children were still alive and living in a distant location, far from West Virginia. According to the medium, the children had been taken by individuals who had been involved in some form of conspiracy, and they were being kept hidden away from their families. While this revelation seemed to offer the hope of a reunion, it was, like many of the leads before it, entirely unverifiable. Despite the Sodders' attempts to follow up on the information provided by the medium, they were unable to find any solid evidence that their children were alive or that they were being held somewhere. The story of the medium's prediction was yet another in a long line of strange and mysterious developments that kept the case alive in the minds of the Sodders, even as time wore on. As the years passed, the case eventually faded from the public eye. Media attention waned, and the authorities seemed to lose interest in the mystery. For many, the fire was an unsolved tragedy, a case that had reached its natural conclusion. But for George and Jenny, the quest for answers never stopped. Despite the passing of time and the mounting difficulties in their search, they clung to the belief that their children might still be out there somewhere, waiting to be found. They never gave up hope, even as the world around them seemed to move on. George passed away in 1969, and Jenny soon followed after in 1989, but both of them held out hope until their deaths that their children would one day be found alive. Their commitment to the search for answers, to uncovering the truth, never wavered, even as the years turned into decades. The unanswered questions surrounding the fire, the mysterious disappearances, the strange leads, and the lack of any closure remained a part of the Sodders' lives until the very end. For them, the tragedy was not just the fire itself, but the enduring uncertainty that came with it. In their hearts, they continued to hold on to the hope that one day the mystery would be solved, and they would be reunited with the children they had lost. But, sadly, that reunion never came, and the mystery of the Sodder children's disappearance remains one of the most enduring unsolved cases in American history. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I see you in the next video.